Well, thank you for staying with us. And this morning we have the privilege once more of hosting a good friend of the station and someone who is very insightful, heads one of the pivotal institutions in this country, in the person of the government statistician, Professor Samuel Annim. What are we going to be talking about? Earnings inequality in the public sector. There's a report on that. And according to that report, the government of Ghana employs over 688,000 persons, with over one third of that is 34.8% of the employees in the Ashanti and Greater Accra regions. Now, the Northeast and the Savannah regions have 1.4% each, giving us a total of 2.8% of the total number of public sector employees. Look at the gap. Now, almost half of public sector employees are aged between 31 and 40 years old. But what do all these dynamics imply for Ghana's development, especially as in other jurisdictions they are complaining about an aged population? We have a pretty young population. What are we doing with that? Joining us for this conversation, we have Professor Samuel Annim, government statistician. Thank you so much, sir, for doing us the honors.
It's always a pleasure. Good morning.
Good morning. And I have to reiterate, you brought us some gifts. Can you walk us through these compilations that you brought us?
Thank you, Benjamin. So I have here 3 documents. One, as you rightly said, yesterday we released the earnings inequalities in the public sector. Indeed, it is the maiden official statistics on earnings inequalities.
I see.
So that is the first document that I'm sharing with you.
This one?
The second one is, again, for the first time, we found the need to do a review of consumer price index and inflation for the previous year.
Right.
So the second document is exactly looking at how inflation CPI, consumer inflation CPI, played out. Why this document is important is that for 2 reasons. 2022 was an exceptionally different year for the country because of our experiences with price hikes throughout the year. And we felt that it's important to see how different policies led to various forms of reductions or slowing down of the inflation rate. And this is important going into 2023 because we always say that inflation is calculated based on the current price changes divided by the previous year's price changes. So the experiences that we had last year would impact on the inflation figures that we're going to get this year. That is why we've put the 2022 review of consumer price index and inflation documented and published it. And the third document, which we are extremely happy to share with you, is the release calendar of our statistical products. Okay. So it's important for persons in Ghana to be informed of our activities because one of the measures of our work is impartiality, which simply means that every statistic that we put out there should be known to the public at the same time. Right. So ahead of the year, it is advised that you publish your release calendar of statistical products so that the general public would follow which products will be released and when they will be released. So this is a compilation of the work that we are going to do as a service for 2023.
Wow. So quite a number of documents. You've really been to work, haven't you? You've been working a lot, putting out a number of things. In fact, under your administration, I've seen a number of, what would you call them, innovations, a number of new things like what you're pointing to, this compilation on the economic inequality bit in the public sector. So we salute you for the good work you've been doing. We'll get to these 2 documents because recently we've spoken about the CPI, we've spoken about inflation slowing down, but food inflation still is going up. What are the dynamics? At least fuel prices are not taking such a toll on us currently. But let's start with the inequality in the public sector. And some of the revelations are stark. You look at some of the population in terms of public sector workers in the northern belt of the country, and then you put that side by side with some other entities, Greater Accra, Kumasi, or the Ashanti region, and you realize that there is quite some inequality in there. Then you look at the numbers. We've always had this issue of a lot of government's funds going into paying people in the public sector with very little left for other projects. What exactly got the Ghana Statistical Service eager to delve into this? Give us that background, please.
So I'm really excited with the way you started it because it's important we put this conversation in a context, and that is exactly what you've asked for. I'm going to articulate at least 3 reasons to support, and if there is time, I'm happy to expand on it. to support why Ghana Statistical Service is doing this. The first is the global perspective, and for us to think about how decisions are made globally and how inequality is contributing to global decisions, which invariably affect us as a country. So if you think about global inequality from two perspectives, one is the income perspective and the other is the wealth perspective. And think about the whole global population being put in three categories. Those of us in the bottom 50%, in the middle 40%, and the top 10%.
Right.
And think about the shares of these different groups of persons for income and for wealth. If you think about the bottom 50% globally, their share of total income is just 8.5%. So 50% globally, the share of income is just 8.5%. The situation is dire if you think about it from the perspective of wealth. The bottom 50%, their share of the total global wealth is just 2%. Why this is striking for us is that this is what puts countries into the so-called G7, G20, and this is what leads to the decisions that they make globally, which invariably affect us. It is important for us to mimic this global picture or think about this global picture at the country level. Ghana Statistical Service is clear that an equal state can never happen. We are not putting up this inequality publication, pushing policymakers to drive us towards an equal state. It's never going to happen. That is an egalitarian state.
We'll never come to the point where everything. That's why in socialist regimes, you would see that over time, they have had their own struggles. We saw what happened in the USSR. We've seen what has happened in the place where I've been, Cuba. We may never have a completely egalitarian society, but we can try to smoothen the creases and try to balance the very rich versus the very poor.
Correct. But indeed, what we all want is fairness, which is equity.
Right.
And
which is equity, indeed.
And the conversation around equity is saying that I am getting this because I am doing this. I am in this situation, you are not in this situation, so I have to get this given my situation. So the conversation about equity should start with inequality. If you don't know your state of inequality, you cannot strive to be fair.
Right.
And inequality, we emphasize that it's just a means, it's not an end. Because it's inequality that will tell you that because I am deprived, because I am earning this low, let me look at my other things. In this case, the other things would be productivity. So we put out this to say to ourselves that if one ministry is on the average getting this income, does it mean that this ministry is more productive than this other ministry? Does it mean that this group of people are doing riskier jobs than this other group, so they have to earn that? So the whole conversation about inequality is we working towards a state of fairness, is we working towards a state that, as we all want, push our gross domestic product up. And the only way we can do that is through productivity. So we need to appreciate the link between inequality and productivity. And yesterday during the release, I said, let's go back to the classroom a little bit. A very basic theory in economics is about the relationship between economic inequality, growth, and development. It's so simple. If a country begins to grow, inequality goes up. If the country reaches a steady state where its growth is consistent and gradually moving up, inequality begins to reduce, and that is when, as a country, you begin to think about development. We have never been able to sustain our growth. We have never been able to say that this is the peak of our inequality.
Because it's always in fits and starts. We go a little and then it tapers.
Exactly.
We go a little.
And even for inequality, since we started measuring it in the early 1990s, it's been inching up. And this is from the consumption expenditure point of view. We started with an index of 0.37, and over the past 4 decades, we are at 0.43. So inequality has been growing, and that is why our development is still a step away, although we see spikes of growth, slow down, and so on.
So we see the disparities, and in fact, it is crucial that we put out these dynamics so that those in power as well, both the technocrats and the politicians, will be able to fashion strategies around this, like you said, the economic principles. What will trigger growth? And how will that impact the inequality and all of that? But the statistics you gave, which we see across the world, usually it's said that the top 3% control so much wealth, in some cases up to 80% of the wealth in different countries. Is that reflective of Ghana as well? Is that typically reflective? There's a general picture, but what is the Ghanaian picture?
So Benjamin, again, it's good we put this in context. This work is representative only for the public sector in Ghana.
Okay.
So we need to think through how the system is run. Let us all not forget that Ghana is deploying the universal salary structure, which means that if you have you are at the same grade, irrespective of your age, your sex, your location, you should be receiving the same amount of money. And this is the state controlling public sector salaries. So to a very large extent, you expect very minimal inequalities within the public sector, apart from inequalities that is as a result of the differences in the grades. So if we see a situation like we published yesterday, where we say that the top 10% of public sector workers have a share of 22% of the total salary, it's nowhere comparable with the global picture that I talked about. It's pretty low. But think about the system. The system is such that we are on a single spine which tries to bring in equality, which tries to bring in some fairness in the payment structure. What for us is striking is the differences within certain payroll categories, the differences across certain MDAs, and differences within certain age categories.
How does, even before I get into the methodology, how you came with all this information, it's also important. How does the single spine salary structure fit into this conversation, especially as we're talking about public sector workers? Has it been able to, so to speak, stem the tide of inequality, or is it only perpetrating even worse? How has that factored into our structure?
Yeah, so the whole idea that underpins the single spine is, again, why we set up the Fair Wages and Salaries Commission.
Right.
The whole idea was to ensure that there is some fairness, there is some harmonization across payment. Indeed, some of the triggers for the single spine was to reduce the allowances component and try and consolidate most of the allowances into the basic salary so that government can really understand the payment that goes to different people for performing different jobs. Two reasons why GSS decided to initiate this was that if this exercise had been done prior to the deployment of the single spine, Benjamin, it would have been easy for us. It would have been easy for us to assess whether single spine had worked or not. And that is why now Ghana Statistical Service is saying that every policy intervention, every strategy should have statistical targets. If you don't have statistical targets, we'll come and sit here and qualitatively we'll say that single spine was successful or was not successful. So at the end of the day, if the single spine was to say that we are reducing inequality from now we are seeing 22% for basic salary to 10%. That is why it is important you do statistics before a policy, you do statistics during a policy, and you do statistics after a policy.
So we got it wrong, right? In rolling out the single spine salary structure, because if I recall correctly, yes, there was some deliberation, but it wasn't extensive. I don't know whether the Ghana Statistical Service was roped in at the time. You were not at post then. And I don't know whether you are aware of any deliberations that might have gone into it. Obviously, we did not have the policy direction that you are speaking of now. We did not have the research, at least from this standpoint, to back it up. Would you say then that it was a bit of an error at the time?
I wouldn't call it an error at all. The bit that I'm talking about is what was the state of affairs. So now I've given you a number saying that public sector inequality is 22% when you use basic salary. It is 23.7% when you use gross salary. So if I deploy a policy now, and I know very well that the Fair Wages and Salary Commission is working around readjusting the salary structure, again based on the universal salary structure. 5 years' time, the two of us can use this baseline figure to assess. So the point that I'm making is that we didn't have this baseline figure when we started the conversation. Now we do.
This then, the next step is to use it to shape policy, to use it to shape things like the single spine salary structure, right?
Yes.
Is that the expectation, that moving on would be able to feed these into that, with the knowledge that we have now, feed these into our salary structures to impact the inequality and inequity, if you like, in the system?
Benjamin, this is exactly what Ghana Statistical Service is doing. We are not doing this work on the blind side of the Fair Wages and Salaries Commission. Yesterday, we made a public announcement that next week, latest next 2 weeks, we're going to have a roundtable discussion where we're going to bring on board the Fair Wages and Salaries Commission. I'm in communication with him always. We're going to bring on board the Public Services Commission. We're going to bring on board the TUC, the trade union, and bring on board a labor expert. Look at all these results and ask ourselves, how would these results feed into the restructuring? And I'm looking forward that other, what I call real sector ministries, would also do the same. The richness of this exercise is that every MDA can do it within the organization. And we are happy to roll out this for every MDA so that you can assess the inequality in earnings within your MDA. You have your own productivity indicators and match them side by side.
Let's look at the methodology that went into this. For any piece of research, you would want to know how the findings were brought to bear. How did you conduct this? I'm looking at a chart here which shows the number of public sector employees by region, and it paints an interesting picture. The Ashanti region has 1 percentage point more than the Greater Accra region, which I found interesting. But then again, if you look at size and other dynamics, you would understand it. But what went into the methodology? How did you arrive at this?
So, traditionally, Ghana Statistical Service has relied on surveys and censuses in collecting data. So we go to people, we have a questionnaire, you fill it out, we come and analyze. The global statistical landscape is changing, and Ghana Statistical Service is positioning itself along those lines.
You're changing along with it. Right.
We have to begin to use administrative data, and let me use this platform to thank the Controller and Accountant General's Department for making this data available to us. Our hope is that other MDAs would provide us with the necessary administrative data to do more of these analyses. So we approached the Controller and Accountant General Department and discussed this with them in terms of what our intent is. And obviously we follow the statistical principles of anonymizing the data, making sure that you are protecting the interests of everybody. So they made available the December payroll data to us, obviously anonymized. We sat down, we got them to explain to us what each of the variables would mean and how we're going to analyze it to come up with something like that. So they gave us a data set of about 688,000 government employees.
Okay.
And we analyzed...
Which reflects the figure.
Exactly. And we analyzed it. So some of the things that we did had to do, we did very minimal cleaning because, again, I must commend them. Their data is in pretty good shape, so there wasn't much of a work to do. So once we got that data, all that we needed to do, get an understanding of the data, and then employ the statistical tools to analyze what we have. So in this document, we've just done basic cross tabulations, and I don't want to bore you with the indices that we computed to arrive at that, but always happy to talk about it.
So like I mentioned, the Ashanti region, Greater Accra regions, contributing just about, 34% of the entire data, 17% for the Greater Accra region, 18% for the Ashanti region. Ashanti with 125,000 plus, the Greater Accra region with 113,000 plus. Then you look at the other dynamics. I mean, there are smaller regions, OT, for example, with 15,000 plus. The Volta region, though, with over 43,000. But then you come to Northeast, one of the newly created regions, 9,423. These dynamics that come to play vis-a-vis the male-female ratio. You would see that per the numbers that we've been given, looking at the disaggregation, we have 374,000 plus males and then 313 plus females. That gives a gap of about 61,000 thereabouts. What does this show vis-a-vis our population dynamics? You conducted the census, you know where we are, just around 31 million. And then when it comes to public sector employment, the gender issue, what does this reveal?
So, two things. Every country should strive for a balanced growth. What balanced growth simply means is that you make sure that across all your administrative regions, there is some minimum level of structured systems that would propel growth. So the first question is, what minimum number do we have? And then the second question is, what other indicators should inform the number that we expect in each region? Now, following from the 2021 population housing census, as we rightly said, the national population was 30.8 million. Greater Accra was slightly higher than Ashanti region. So one would quickly ask that if Greater Accra had a slightly higher population than Ashanti region, why would we see the reverse when it comes to public sector employees? Benjamin, the question is, as a country, have we thought through, one, that minimum number that I talked about, for every state, for every region to have in terms of public sector employees? Then we can question why Northeast is holding just about 9,000, whereas Greater Accra and Ashanti region are holding more than a third of it. If we've not had that conversation to know the minimum number, we can't go ahead with it. So it is our expectation that government will see these numbers and then say that, okay, for each region, we need at least 10,000 people based on A, B, C, D. Then the population will come in, then the poverty situation would come in, then the development growth trajectory would come in to inform the maximum number that we have. Right. But unfortunately, that conversation is yet to occur. From the male-female perspective, I wouldn't worry so much about that, because as I said, if you are deploying that universal salary structure, it's independent of these demographics. And in any case, the proportion that we are seeing now is in line with what we saw during the 2021 population housing census, where we have a relatively higher number for males.
And to top up with this disaggregation and the sort of information we need, I've always asked myself, correct me if I'm wrong, but do we know, for example, in this country, how many engineers, I mean, yes, we have groupings for these, but how many engineers do we need in a coming year? How many accountants would our system require? How many technical people are we going to require in sector A, sector B, sector C to ensure that we can meet our jobs gap, but oftentimes because of unemployment. But that is how planning should be. What does this show in that respect? And is that something we should be looking at?
Definitely. And I mean, we've always been looking for the opportunity to engage with the right ministries, the right associations to have this number. And it's so critical. And if we don't know the number of professionals that we need at any point in time, then what is informing our growth path? Our growth path would be informed by what we think we need in terms of the technocrats.
And I also look at pages 11 and 13 of this recent report on income inequality in the public sector, and I found some very interesting things. Government paid about 2.3 billion in salaries and allowances for public sector employees in December 2022, just December 2022. 2.3 billion Ghana cedis. That's what we're talking about, the 688,000. But then you look at the top 10% of the employees with the highest net salaries, and the top 10% earns 22% of the total net salary. And half of the employees earn only 1/3 of the total net salary. I found that interesting. It reflects, in a way, the global picture that we painted at the start of this discussion. What does this reveal?
Let's put in a caveat again from the methodology point of view. And this is very important, and we are hoping that we're going to get your support moving forward, because we really are going to institutionalize this conversation. Benjamin, this 2.3 billion that we've published is definitely an understatement of underestimation of what government is really paying to its employees.
You're telling me it's even more than what is here?
Yes, and we footnoted that. And this is because there are some state institutions that do not run their salaries through the Controller and Accountant General's Department. Bank of Ghana doesn't run its salary through there. The Revenue Authority does not. SNIT does not. Some of our traditional universities do not run their salaries through there. And all these are government employees, and government is paying them on monthly basis. The only reason is that they are not on the Controller and Accountant General.
Why is that? Because according to this, that would be a 10% deficit. According to the footnote you've put here, those government employees on the CAGD payroll, that is the Controller and Accountant General's Department, constitute about 90% of the total number, which would mean that about 10% of these people, and that's quite a chunk. we don't know how much they are earning, how much we are paying them, and that's where the problem usually starts.
I mean, this is something that I am told that conversations are ongoing to ensure that all of us are enrolled on one system. Even if we are not enrolled on one system, there should be a mechanism for the Statistical Service to have access to this information to inform decision making. And that is where the roundtable conversation will try and bring on board some of the strategies that we have to put in place going forward to get a complete picture of public sector employees.
When I look at page 13, what comes to mind is equal pay for equal work, in a way reflected by the single spine salary structure. But how is it that the top 10% of our employees, public sector, with the highest net salaries are earning 22% of the total net salary, while half of the employees, I'm sure those in the bottom half, are earning only a third of that? The public sector employees, does this include, our political leaders as well? I mean, how does this shape out?
So,
and maybe the heads of SOEs, for example.
So if we go further into the report, we're going to get a better understanding of some of these things. But again, I emphasize the 22%, the top 10% taking 22% of the total salaries. From my point of view, it's not too concerning, given the global picture that we presented. But when we're rolling out the single spine, the question is, did we expect this picture? Don't forget that we have people with different grades. We have people with different skills. So definitely we expect some level of inequality.
Variation in.
Yes. Yeah. So the key question is, did we expect a variation to this extent where the top 10% will be taking 22% and the bottom 20% will be taking just 11% of the total salary?
So basically what we're saying is that the top 10% is taking about what? 20+%.
22%.
About a fifth.
Yes.
A fifth.
Yes.
Of the general kitty. A
Yes.
fifth. That's not, is that too much, or is that just around what our expectations would have been?
That's what I'm saying. What informed the single spine salary? If the pegs that we put on the different grades was expecting something like that, then we can answer. But on top of our heads, we cannot say that it's what we expected because we didn't design the single spine. Yeah. And this is the conversation that I want Fair Wages to take into consideration moving into the review. So that once you are reviewing, we are saying that this is the inequality that we expect, and if we deviate from it, then there is something that we need to think about. Let me quickly mention that this exercise is giving us an opportunity to see where our skilled employees are located. It's very important we think about that, because if you are paying based on grades, based on level of skills, and we find a particular location having a higher average earnings, then the assumption will be that this is where the skills are located. So it takes us back to the question of balanced and unbalanced growth.
Let's look at a few more pieces of information, just to add to what you've said. So when you look at the average allowances, they are much higher for persons with a higher net salary, which stands to reason. The allowances of people with a basic salary of between 5,000 and 9,999, just a shave of 10,000 Ghana cedis, are more than 26 times larger. They should be larger, but 26 times more than those of people with a net salary below 1,000 Ghana cedis. 26 times. You know, it's been said that sometimes in the public sector, someone's allowances alone are many times more than someone's actual salary. And those are some of the issues to look at. I'll ask for your take on that and how we can remedy the situation. But then, I would also like us to look at this chart in terms of the male-female comparatives when it comes to average earnings. You would realize that the females are earning 2,504 cedis, averagely, and the men, 2,669. That gives about 660?
No,
okay, so no, it's 500, so about 100, 165. And then you look at the dynamics. When it comes to the Greater Accra region, always it has the highest, and it's reflective here. The Northeast, I think, has the lowest, 2,212. What explains these dynamics? Because I posed this question from education to everything else. If you recall, those in the northern belt of the country had been deprived all the way from pre-independence to independence days. It appears this deprivation continues even now in economic terms. Education is also a factor. So lower education would also mean likely lower ability to earn a higher income. What picture does this paint, especially with the allowances and then the regional dynamics and the male to female comparatives?
So it's one of the highlights of this release, and we always want to reflect on it. As I indicated, one of the objectives of the single spine was to try and minimize the allowances or the differentials that is associated with the allowances. And yesterday we made a categorical statement that allowances deepen earnings inequality. And the reason why we say that is exactly what you said. If you look at allowances, it varies across various income earning groups. And the picture that you painted the 26 times, I always want to simplify it so that we appreciate the extent to which that differential is of a concern. If you think about those who earn less than 3,000 relative to those who earn less than 5,000, the differences in in allowances is 10 times. So those who earn...
Could you repeat that?
Those who earn less than 3,000 Ghana cedis, their allowances is around 800 Ghana cedis.
Right.
And those who earn more than 5,000 Ghana cedis, their allowances is about 8,000 Ghana cedis.
Wow.
So it's a 10 times difference. So the question is that what we expect again? And does it reflect the risk, the productivity, and so on?
Those are the questions, because if it's equal pay for equal work, or even if it's to say that you are doing so much and so you deserve so much, and you are doing so little and so you deserve so little, then these dynamics may not come to play, because someone who may be earning the 3,000 category may even be doing more work than the person earning above 5,000 and who is earning about 10 times more or 5 times more in terms of allowances.
This is why we say that this is just a means. The next step is to measure productivity. And then align earnings with productivity.
I can't wait for the productivity bit, especially in terms of our SOEs, state-owned enterprises, and the leadership and sometimes the packages they give themselves. I mean, we've heard of some of these leaders who are earning many times more than even the executive, the president and the vice, some earning 60,000, 70,000 plus. And it wouldn't be shocking if you look at, I remember in the UK at some point, the credit crunch and everything, there were concerns about some top CEOs and what they were earning monthly and the perks they were getting. But the question is, what are they delivering? Productivity. How much are they contributing? If some CEO is making, $2 billion for the country and we're giving him or her something as a show of, look, we're supporting this because it is because of your leadership that we are getting this. Fine. But many of them are in the red. They are not even in the black. They are not contributing. And yet we keep paying these huge sums of money.
Statistics is the way to go. We need the numbers on all these.
So from this end, based on this fantastic documents that you have come up with, Ghana 2022, Earnings Inequality in the Public Sector, what would you say in the immediate term we should start looking at? In the immediate term, what should we start looking at?
So as I indicated, in the next couple of weeks, we're going to have that roundtable discussion. We're going to work closely with Fair Wages and Salaries Commission, Public Services Commission, and the TUC and the labor expert are coming on board to see how this is going to inform the restructuring of the single spine. The second thing that we're going to do immediately, which we started doing, is the measurement of labor productivity. As we speak, we are just about signing an agreement with the International Labour Organization. We even have a consultant in town so that we can begin to measure labor productivity. Then we do the alignment in the medium term.
What are your projections? I mean, yes, you still have to engage other parties, but what are your projections in terms of this productivity survey? When are you hoping that after your engagements, you'll be able to come out with them?
Currently, Ghana Statistical Service is trying to push for a data revolution agenda, and that's going to be the basis of all the conversations that we are having. There's little that we can do on our side. As I indicated earlier on, we need full state commitment of all the ministries to provide us with the needed data. If we want to measure labor productivity, you need the input and the output across all the government MDAs, and then later move into the public sector. If we are able to get that, we can say that within 2-3 years, Ghana will start producing labor productivity indices on a regular basis.
Right before you take leave of us, we've seen the latest CPI and the dynamics in there. I don't know whether there's any specific matter you would like to touch on briefly. Yesterday, we had an interaction with one of your colleagues, and maybe give us a hint of what we can expect from your product release calendar as well to wrap the conversation.
Thank you. So we saw a turnaround of the reverse in CPI, and again, I'm happy with the details that you are providing now. We did see a turnaround, but we saw it from different perspectives if you disaggregate the data.
Yeah.
My concern is the widening disparity between food and non-food, and we saw a reversal, a decline in non-food of about 2 percentage points, but we saw an increase of about 1.3 percentage points from a food perspective. So now we have...
And that serves as a counterbalance.
Yes. So now we have a wider gap between food and non-food of about 13.1 percentage points. We continue to see a wider gap between inflation for items that we import relative to those that are locally produced. I've said this, and I'll use this platform to say it again. We need to know the build-up cost from the farm gate to the final consumer. We need to know the build-up cost from the ports to the final consumer. And then we can appreciate the triggers. Yeah. The monetary policies, to an extent, have worked. We can attribute the reverse to the stability in the exchange rate, but from the food perspective, it is not a monetary policy issue. We need to think about how we deal with our real sectors, i.e. the Ministry of Food and Agriculture, the Ministry of Trade and Industry, to see how we can address the challenges that I'm alluding to in terms of the farm gate to consumer and from the port to the consumer.
And that's a very interesting picture you paint, because once we can measure that, then we can tell from farm gate to buyer, these are likely the additional costs from the port to a buyer or consumer. These are the likely costs. And it would make our data even more concrete, wouldn't it?
It would be.
I look forward to some of those discussions, especially as you engage the Fair Wages and Salaries Commission and as we get to productivity levels. I think oftentimes the problem is with the public sector. The private sector seems to have this pretty well covered, especially the MNCs when they come into the country. When it comes to productivity and measurements, KPIs and all of that, it seems to be pretty straightforward. But the public sector, especially in our part of the world, always is the problem. So,
but we are hoping for the private sector to make these data sets available. Because at the end of the day, we need a country-wide picture.
Have you made the approach?
As I said, we inaugurated the National Statistics Advisory Committee, and it's one of the reasons why we are calling for the data revolution year and policy, so that we can bring everybody on board. Private sector will not see Ghana Statistical Service as going to expose whatever they are doing, which will affect their competition and all that. So we are deepening statistical literacy in a way that people would really see the value in making data available to the service.
Prof, always so good, so insightful having you. Thank you for joining the conversation. And once more, thank you for the gifts. It's not just these 3 copies. He gave us 3 sets of each, and we're going to be sharing them to our group so that we can analyze them and also chip in where we can. Thank you so much, Prof.
Pleasure. Thank you.
And that is Professor Samuel Prof Annim, government statistician, who joined us for this discussion. We have a lot more coming your way on the AM show. We're going to be talking education up next. All of those who have to engage in self-placement from the basic level to the secondary level. The CSSPS did not place them, but how are they going to cope? Yesterday, parents, pupils thronged the Nat Hall. What is the latest on that development? And how can we maybe smoothen the process and make it better? All of those conversations still to come on the AM show. Don't you forget, today, owing to the timing of some of our conversations, Blunt Thoughts will be coming your way much later. Do stay. We'll be right back.